starting in the 24th chapter. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day who you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. May God add his blessings to the scripture reading.
Amen. Thank you very much. And I'd like to invite the children to come down and sit in the big circle with me. I want to tell you all a story from the life of Jesus. We just heard a story from the Old Testament, reading from the Bible. Now I'm going to tell you something about the life of Jesus. Are there stories about Jesus when he was a baby? Are there stories about Jesus? What are those stories about? Yes, the stories about Jesus. Watching an old favorite movie of mine this last week. It's a documentary, actually, and it's about mountain climbing. And we're not doing serious mountain climbing, but we went up to Colorado. And this was a story, it was a true story. It's called Touching the Bowl. So it was a documentary, true story about these guys back in the 80s who went all the way down to South America to climb the southern round of this mountain that had never been climbed quite that way before. Some real serious mountain climbers, rock climbing up the cliffs and ice climbing and all that. And their story was very interesting all the way through, but then it really got interesting. They got to the top of the mountain. They kind of got summit fever. They just had to get to the top, even though they saw some bad weather was coming in. Bad weather comes in, they're heading down the mountain, and one of them hurts. His heart breaks his leg on the way down. So the other's trying to help him get down the mountain. He's sort of lowering him down, even though it's whiteout conditions, he can't see anything. He lowers the guy, one climber who's helping, lowers his friend who's been hurt down to the end of the rope, and he doesn't hit anything. He's just hanging there. And they're in terrible condition. Both of them are injured, both of them are tired. This great storm's blowing. The guy doesn't have the energy to lift this guy back up again. And so that's sort of the pivotal moment of the movie. There he is. We've heard about this, right? The climber's on the mountain. There's one climber hanging onto the rope. The other one's down below, hanging from the rope. And the climber up at the top has to decide, am I going to cut the rope, or am I not going to cut the rope? Cut the rope. If he doesn't do it, he's going to die. The guy hanging onto the wire's going to die. If he does, then his friend certainly will. And that idea of whether or not to cut the rope makes me think of. I know we don't do this situation. And we have probably will never most of us be in this situation. But friends, we are all of us. Each and every one of us, we are tied to other people. We're tied to members of our community. We're tied to our family. We're tied to our friends, we're tied to our fellow church members, our co-workers, our neighbors, even strangers that live around us and live here in our community with us. We are tied to them. See, that's a great way to think about it, to explain and to understand the word for today, which is responsibility. We are tied to other people, and we are responsible for them. And so we're asked the question, we think about it, we think about our society we're in and all the ways we're tied to others, is sometimes they're going to be in need. Sometimes they're going to be pulling us down too. And the question for us is, do we cut them loose? Do we let them go? There's a part of us, I know, as human beings, especially as Christians, that say, absolutely not. We cannot cut them loose. We cannot let them go. After all, we read in the Bible and read in the very first book of the Bible, Cain killing his brother Abel, and then screaming out to God, crying out to God, am I my brother's keeper? And the implied answer to that is yes, of course. We are all each other's keepers. We are all responsible for the folks near us and next to us, and sometimes even strangers we're responsible for, as Jesus told us. Somebody asked him, who are our neighbors? Who do we count among our neighbors? And Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, and how this foreigner, this person from outside of the country, outside of the religion, helped the fellow who was wounded, who was bleeding. And we also hear Jesus say that there's no greater gift that one person can give than to lay down his life for another. And so we think about this idea, and we think about this rope and being on that ledge, and being in that kind of a no-win situation. No winners in that situation. We ask, do we cut the rope or not? And there's a part of us that says, absolutely not. But there's another argument as well. And it's worth our thinking about and our considering. And that's that not only can we cut the rope, we should. It is our responsibility to cut the rope. After all, there are a lot of connections in this society, a lot of connections we choose for ourselves, we choose for our families, and they're not always good for us. Right? Jeff, in his prayer today, talked about the little g gods. The little g gods, like in our scripture reading, we get to choose between the big G God and the little g gods that are all around us. And boy, there can be lots of different ones. Lots of different things taking our attention away from the big G God. And they can be connections that we have in our society that are one of the saddest things I've ever seen. And they can even be in our family. And that's one of the saddest things I've seen at my last church. I remember there was a couple there who had a son who just kept asking for more. He's grown. He should have been out on his own, but he kept on asking for more and more money. They kept giving him money so he could go to this school or that training, so that he could buy a truck, so he could buy a business. And finally, they just were never able to cut that rope. And he pulled them down with him. And there's a time when we are going to be pulled down in our society by those little g gods. And sometimes that's even family. Sometimes it's even friends. And the best thing that we can do is, the thing that we're being called to do is to cut that rope. That's what Joshua was talking about today in the scripture reading. He comes into this new land and he asks the people, his people, who are you going to serve? You should serve God, he said. You should serve God. You should follow God. But if you're not going to, then choose who you are going to serve. Don't waffle back and forth. Pick somebody you are going to serve. But as for me, as for my family, we are serving God. And that's the axe. That's the rope being cut right there. It's like you may drag yourself down by serving other gods, by not choosing the path that God has for you. But I'm not going with you. I'm severing that line right now. So we think about it, we're up on that ledge and something is dragging us down, dragging our families down, dragging those we love down, and should we cut the rope? Well, there's a part of us that says absolutely. But we can't leave it there. But let me tell you, these situations, these no-win situations that we find ourselves in, where we are up on a ledge and we're desperately hanging on to some rope and someone we love is down below, and we have to decide whether to cut the rope or not. Often these situations we are in because we have chosen to be in. Because of some temptation that we gave into long, long ago, something we thought we would never find out about, and we gave into that temptation, and then we gave into another, and another, and another, and soon, before we know it, we are up on that cliff. We are hanging on to that rope. And who's on the other end of it? Who are on the other end of these ropes that are hanging down before us that we're grabbing onto? It is our children. It is our parents. It is our friends and our neighbors, people who are hanging on the line. And friends, that is a terrible place for us to be. Sitting there, holding on to those lines, knowing that we're in a situation where somebody is going to be hurt. And so we take it back to Joshua. And we remember that what we can do is, instead of waiting until we get to those moments where we have to decide whether to cut the rope or not cut the rope, we start right now. We start today by saying, we're not going to take that first step. We're not going to give in to that first temptation. We're certainly not going to give in to the second or the third or the fourth that leads us to that ledge. And how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to do it by saying right along with Joshua, you determine who you serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Let's bow in prayer. Lord God, we give you thanks for all the blessings that you give us, Lord. We ask that you be with us every day. Give us strength to overcome the temptations that we find ourselves in. And Lord, even when we have given into them, even when we find ourselves up on some cliff, hanging on desperately, help us to know and to realize that you are there with us, and help us to make courageous decisions. In Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen.